Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Hello, this is David Myers, host of this episode of Then and Now and director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. Our guest today is Benjamin Nathans, who teaches history at the University of Pennsylvania, where he serves as the Alan Charles Kors Endowed Term Professor. Ben Nathans is the author of the monumental new book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, published by Princeton University Press, which was awarded the 2025 Pulitzer Prize in General Fiction, as well as the 2025 Pushkin House Book Prize. To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause is the definitive historical account of the Soviet Dissident Movement. It vividly brings to life the rich personalities of the leading dissidents, the ingrained resistance of the Soviet system, and the remarkable guiding strategy of the movement. In the course of this massive and magisterial book, Ben Nathans sheds light on a key chapter in 20th century Soviet history, but also on the history of human rights as they developed over the course of the century. Ben was previously a guest on Then and Now in 2022, along with our late UCLA colleague Arch Getty, talking about the Russia-Ukraine war. That episode was one of the most popular in the history of this podcast. So it is a delight to have Ben Nathans back on Then and Now.
Thank you, David. So good to be here.
So let's start at the beginning. When did you begin to work on this book, and what drew you to the Soviet dissident movement?
I began thinking about the problems that the book raises about 20 years ago. And the main one, at least the initial one, was my curiosity about how people who live in authoritarian societies construe their political options, especially their options for public engagement. And then the sort of question that naturally follows, when and why do some of those people choose to act on those thoughts about becoming publicly engaged? I recognize that this was a question that could be applied to many different societies. And in the contemporary period, that included the Soviet Union, which was the one I was best trained to address, but also China and Iran and North Korea. And really up until just a couple of years ago, I never imagined that my own country would be on that list, and that a version of that question, suitably modified to reflect the circumstances, would also resonate with readers in the United States.
Yeah, I hope we'll get to that more contemporary iteration of the problem that initially drew to the book. But I'm just curious, insofar as we share a very strong interest in European Jewish history, did you see any connection between your prior work that was reflected in your book Beyond the Pale and your interests in this book?
Someone helped me see the connection that I had not seen before, and that person was Jonathan Frankel, who, during our very first conversation about, at a very early inchoate stage of my thinking about this dissident project, remarked that there was a noticeable thread that connected my interest in lawyers and the use of law in a multinational state and an emerging multinational civil society in Imperial Russia on the one hand, and the grand strategy of the dissident movement in the 1960s and 70s, which was heavily based on a kind of legal literalism. I had managed not to see that about myself.
I must confess, I did see that connection. It was
good. Okay.
Jonathan Frankel did as well.
Yes.
So tell us what some of the main challenges were in writing this book, especially in terms of gaining access to source material.
Sure. Well, when I initially started conceiving of this, I was a person with 3 young kids and a demanding job. And I thought, I need to choose a topic where I can really do most of the research close to home. And so I thought maybe I'll do a biography of Andrei Sakharov as a kind of window into the dissident movement. Sakharov's papers, most of them anyway, have been deposited They were then at Brandeis, and then the archive shifted to the Houghton Library Manuscript Division at Harvard. And I thought, I could just go up to Boston periodically to do the research, and it'll be a much more contained research project at a time when I really needed to be home. Um, and then in the course of starting out on that road, and especially talking to the archivist of the Sakharov papers, who himself was a former dissident, a man named Alexander Gribanov, who is still alive today. We had wonderful conversations, and he convinced me early on that Sakharov was not a good vehicle because he was so exceptional, so unusual, and came relatively late to the movement. So, like so many plans, that one went up in smoke pretty quickly. And I found myself working on a project where the archives were as dispersed as the former dissidents themselves. There's really a kind of dissident diaspora. Many, many people were forced to leave the Soviet Union and ended up in the United States, in Germany, in Israel, in England, in Canada. And sure enough, I ended up doing research in 5 different countries in, about a two dozen or so archives, precisely what I had hoped to avoid. But that's just the way the topic took shape over time. And in terms of the source material, I mean, we can talk about this in detail later, but the great challenge for me initially was that there were so many published memoirs by dissidents. I mean, it was really an embarrassment of riches. I keep a running database of book length memoirs or autobiographies by former Soviet dissidents, and there are over 150.
Right.
And I thought, on the one hand, this is great, but on the other hand, this is really risky because I'm in danger of just reproducing their own version of their stories. So it took a while for me to find a way to break out of that echo chamber and find an independent place to stand.
So, one of the ways you did that was by identifying what was the guiding strategy of the dissident movement. You hinted at it just a minute ago by talking about legal formalism. And that guiding strategy is a kind of counterintuitive approach that you describe as civil obedience, the insistence of the dissidents that, quote, Soviet law should be taken seriously, especially the Soviet Constitution of 1936. And one of the key figures in formulating the strategy is the dissident mathematician Alexander Volpin, who eventually made his way to Boston, where, I should add, he was befriended by another brilliant and eccentric mathematician, my late father-in-law, Gabriel Stolzenberg.
Yes.
But let's go back to the strategy of civil obedience and how Volpin came to it. Can you describe the strategy and how it really crystallized as such a powerful and, as I said a minute ago, counterintuitive approach to resisting the system?
Sure. Yeah, this is one of the most fascinating threads, I think, in the book, and it's the story that launches the history. So Volpin, as you said, was a mathematician, and not just a mathematician, but someone who was interested in the nature of truth statements in the field of mathematics. How do we know something's true? What constitutes a valid proof? What criteria do we use for truth? So he was, as he described it, a meta-mathematician, someone who was interested in analyzing the nature of mathematical statements themselves. And he, was born in 1924 and sort of came of age in the mid 20th century. And because of that timing, he was caught up in two very important intellectual movements of the early and mid 20th century. One, chronologically, the first was ideal language philosophy, pioneered by Ludwig Wittgenstein, but finding acolytes and practitioners throughout the interwar period, especially in Oxford, where analytic philosophy ruled the roost. And ideal language philosophy is about the idea that most of what we think of as the major philosophical problems are actually just reflections of the ambiguity of the language that we use to think about philosophy. In other words, the human languages, whether it's English or German or Russian or Hebrew or what have you. And ideal language philosophy was about in its soft version, was about purging human languages of their ambiguity. So let me give you an example. And this is one of thousands that you could come up with. So in English, the word patient has at least two very, very different meanings. One is the person who is being treated by a physician. The other is an adjective to describe someone who has the capacity to wait. I don't think that they're semantically related. They could be, in the way back in the mists of etymological history, but for all intents and purposes, they have these two entirely unrelated meanings, and yet they're spelled the same way, they're pronounced the same way. And this is one of many, many examples of the way that language hardwires ambiguity into itself. Or one could say multivalence, multiple possibilities for meaning, for semantic content. So the ideal language school was hell-bent on essentially removing those kinds of ambiguities in an attempt to make the language with which we think capable of the kind of rigor that we expect of mathematics. The other sort of hard version of ideal language philosophy is human languages, no matter which one, they're hopeless. They're hopelessly ambiguous. It's great for poetry, but it's terrible for philosophy. So we need to invent another language, a language that can achieve perfect transparency, precision, and clarity. Another movement in which Vulpen was caught up was cybernetics, which traces its origins to an MIT professor named Norbert Wiener. And here the idea was about translation. People talk a lot now about translational medicine or translational science, meaning translating breakthroughs in basic research into applications. Cybernetics is also about translation, but it's a different kind. It's about translating all kinds of phenomena, whether it's language or economics or jurisprudence or even discourse, into the language of algorithms, into a quantified language that can create or at least mimic the rigor of scientific claims and mathematical claims. So just to fast forward, Vulpen is very enamored of both of these movements, and he takes on the quest to create an ideal language, and a language that has the clarity and precision of mathematics. And like pretty much everybody else who went down that road, he never really succeeded in creating that language. The current field of computer science, of software engineering, is another branch that was followed in that quest for a perfect language of clarity and precision. And it has achieved remarkable success, although not the original ambitions, although AI claims to be on the way to getting there. So Vulpen, tries to invent this language, doesn't succeed, but because of his biography, he ends up having a series of experiences that allow him to pursue a kind of plan B. And those experiences are his very unpleasant encounters with the Soviet punitive system under Joseph Stalin. He gets in trouble for writing satirical poetry, or I would say satirical doggerel, and reading it, he thinks, in private to friends. There's obviously an informant in the room. And in 1949, when he's been sent to the Ukrainian city of Chernivtsi, which is where one of my grandmothers happened to have been born, this is in current southern Ukraine. He is arrested for penning this doggerel, and he is initially sent to a psychiatric prison because they suspect that he is schizophrenic, or perhaps someone wanted to give him a break by declaring him schizophrenic so that he would avoid prolonged imprisonment. And then he is shipped off to internal exile in Central Asia, in Karaganda. And this is the first of a series of run-ins with the Soviet punitive apparatus. And like many prisoners, he has a lot of time on his hands, whether he's in the psychiatric hospital or in internal exile. And one of the ways that he spends his time while a prisoner is he goes to the prison library and discovers that they have copies of the Soviet Constitution and the Soviet Code of Criminal Procedure. And he proceeds, in out of a sense of interest in his own case and what he might do, he proceeds to read these documents. But he reads them with a very special agenda and a very special mind, I would say. He's got this ideal language quest always in the back of his mind. And at some point, he realizes that Soviet law, like all legal systems, is attempting to do something very similar, which is to state with maximum clarity what you are forbidden to do, what you are permitted to do, and what you must do. These are the three moral categories of behavior: permission, injunction, and the forbidding or ban. And at some point, he has a kind of eureka moment, and he realizes that while his quest to invent a new language of perfect clarity and precision is not really going anywhere, Soviet law is not a bad approximation. And I worked with Volpin's unpublished diaries, which are housed in the Memorial Society's archive in Moscow, or now they're probably in someone's apartment since that organization was liquidated several years ago by Putin. You can trace in his diaries the formation of this strategy and the idea that, there are really rather impressive sounding civil liberties in the Soviet Constitution. If only they were observed in practice, you could place serious constraints on the arbitrary behavior of the Soviet government. And this becomes Volpin's quest. He has this amazing entry on New Year's Eve. He always, among other times, he always wrote diary entries on New Year's Eve in a way taking stock of the previous year and setting out his goals for the next one. And in one of the late 1950s New Year's Eve's entry, he writes, "I have settled on this approach, this legalistic approach to containing the power of the Soviet state. I'm just waiting for the right occasion to put it into practice."
And so what is the translational movement? How is this principle of sort of legal formalism rooted in ideal language theory and cybernetics? How is it operationalized?
The idea is the law as it exists, the civil liberties in the Soviet Constitution, and the various procedural protections outlined in the Code of Criminal Procedure. And that means, what can count as evidence? Do you have the right to a defense attorney? Yes, you do. Pre-trial detention, all of the sort of formal regulations for treating defendants in criminal cases. All of this is rather nicely put in the Code of Criminal Procedure. The problem is it's just ignored or observed only in the breach in practice. So Volpin's strategy is just deceptively simple. We need to pressure the Soviet state to honor existing law, not to change the law, not to topple the government, not to take power ourselves, not to launch a revolution, but to spread legal consciousness, the idea of the rule of law, through the Soviet population and enact or engage in forms of protest that will induce the government to honor its own laws.
So when dissidents are brought to trial and bring to the courtroom this doctrine, how do state legal actors react?
They're dumbfounded. And of course, the KGB, which stage managed every remotely political trial, was also initially dumbfounded. The KGB, and keep in mind that in the Soviet system, there was no formal division between domestic intelligence work and foreign intelligence work, the way we have in this country between the FBI and the CIA. The KGB covered all domains. And the lion's share of their work, as is being shown in a wonderful forthcoming book by my friend and colleague at Stanford, Amir Viner, on the history of the KGB, the lion's share of the KGB's work was always domestic. In the United States, we tend to focus on the international cases for obvious reasons, especially during the Cold War. But truly, the majority of the KGB's efforts were domestic. So the KGB had decades of experience combating and suppressing monarchists, anti-communists, nationalists, and fascists of various types. It had a lot of experience combating people who were protesting or demonstrating or engaging in subversive behavior in the name of what they called true Leninism. or neo-Leninism, that is somehow getting the Soviet regime back on track, back on the track that had been outlined in 1917 by Vladimir Lenin himself. What they had zero experience in suppressing were constitutionalists, and they were confused. I mean, on the face of it, how can you suppress someone whose agenda is to enforce the Soviet constitution? So the Soviet, the KGB was unaccustomed to this new genre of agitation and resistance, and it showed in the initial trials of people that they arrested for, disseminating uncensored texts or publishing their work abroad. It was a struggle. And the thing that made it even more of a struggle is that by the time we get to the period where my book begins, which is the late 1950s, early 1960s, the KGB is really making a substantial effort to modernize itself and become a really professional contemporary intelligence organization, not the kind of organization that existed under Stalin, where millions of people, innocent people, were arrested, forced to go through trials that can only be called farcical in terms of their standards of evidence, not to mention the use of torture and threats against the defendants and their family members. By the time you get to the post-Stalin era, which really is an enormous caesura in Soviet history, right down the middle in 1953, by the time you get to that post-Stalin era, the KGB, which has been renamed the KGB to distance itself from its predecessor, the NKVD, which really engaged in horrific acts of the miscarriage of justice. It's trying to be a professional intelligence organization. It's trying to play by the rules, including the rules of judicial procedure. And so what happens in these trials, I mean, there are many of them, but the initial one is in 1966, is the defendants are not tortured. And actual evidence is introduced and is contested. And most shocking of all, the defendants plead not guilty. They refuse to confess to the crimes that are alleged against them. And, enough of the old NKVD habits were still around that the outcome of the trial was really never in doubt. There's every reason to believe that the KGB instructed the judge not only to produce a guilty verdict, but to produce this specific sentence for this defendant and that specific sentence for that defendant. So the KGB essentially always got the juridical outcome that it wanted, namely a guilty verdict. But the public relations fallout was terrible. It not only didn't go the way the KGB wanted, it was very damaging to the reputation of the Soviet government.
Was it precisely the doctrine of civil obedience that was part of that public relations disaster? Meaning, was the public actually aware of what was going on? The dissidents had a strategy. The legal actors of the state were dumbfounded and then sort of caught on. To what extent did awareness of this strategy make its way out into the wider world of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, it took a while. Certainly not in the course of this particular trial. The most striking enactment of the strategy was the decision to surreptitiously create an unofficial transcript, a verbatim transcript of the trial. That task was undertaken by the wives of the defendant, Larisa Bogoraz and Maria Razanova. I should mention the defendants themselves were Andrei Sinyavsky and Yulia Daniel. Bogoraz was Daniel's wife. Bogoraz was a trained linguist, very good at shorthand notation, and she's largely responsible for creating a verbatim transcript of the 3-day trial. And that transcript eventually circulated underground in the Soviet Union and then was smuggled abroad and translated and published in multiple languages. For most people, the takeaway of the transcript alone was the heroism of the writers in defending the autonomy of the literary imagination from the clutches of law and ideology. Now, that's not Volpin's strategy. Volpin really was uninterested in the autonomy of the literary imagination. What he wanted to show was the extent to which the trial lived up to the norms that were codified in the criminal code. He expressly told people, I'm not going to read what Sinyavsky and Daniel have written because the content of their work is irrelevant to me. All I care about is that the trial is open to the public, open to scrutiny, and maximally faithful to criminal procedure norms. So his criteria for evaluating the trial were very different from those of the defendants and most of their supporters. And there was just also tremendous, I would say, instinctive resistance to Volpin's strategy, even within the intelligentsia and the Moscow intelligentsia. And the resistance was very, very powerful. It was, you're so naive to take Soviet law at face value. The government doesn't care about its laws. It does what it wants to do based on political expediency. So why are you invoking this fiction of Soviet law and Soviet civil liberties when everybody knows that it's just window dressing? Volpin encountered this counter attack many, many times, and his response was always the same. You're part of the problem. If more people really did take the law seriously and literally, then we'd be on our way to being able to place constraints on what our own government can do to us. And your cynical attitude, your, supposedly worldly, elevated attitude towards the law, that's the crux of the problem right now.
This reminds one of a key point toward the end of the book, Ben, which you call the final paradox, which is for all of their commitment, the dissidents, to this idea of civil obedience, they were a rather disobedient lot. They were not a group that tended to heed norms, rules, dictates themselves. And you've just spoken to the divergences of opinion within the movement. So this is kind of an animating principle, it seems, of the story, this tension between this fantastic legal invention and the actual behavior of your actors.
Yeah. And David, I'll be curious whether you've had an experience like the one I had. Namely, it took me years to see that in their own internal workings and in the drama of their internal collective lives, or collective life, I should say, the dissidents were absolutely allergic to rules. And in this sense, they were very Soviet. They had adopted, perhaps subconsciously, but at some level, they had adopted the very widespread Soviet habit of always looking for ways to circumvent the rules and the system. That was how people survived and managed to live reasonably decent and dignified lives, was by working around the law, not by observing.
Is this what you meant when you described the dissidents as children of the Soviet system themselves? It's precisely not the obedience, but the constant strategizing to evade the dictates of the system that
Yes,
makes it.
that's one of the things that I had in mind when I said that we will only understand dissidents when we stop seeing them as Western liberals who had the misfortune of being born on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, and instead see them as profoundly shaped by their time and place, children of the Soviet system. But when I look back now, it astounds me how long it took me to see that paradox. I'm wondering, have you had that experience where you read text over and over again, and then 2 years, 3 years later, you finally see something that once you see it, it's everywhere and obvious?
Well, I will say that in the last book that I wrote, together with my wife Naomi Stolzenberg, whom you know, we studied a community of ultra-Orthodox or Haredi Jews who themselves were very rules bound by certainly by a self imagination and by popular perception. And yet one sees within the operation of such a community all sorts of defiance of communal rules that it took some time to recognize, especially on the fringes. But those fringes were also the places where leaders tended to aggregate. So it's what you're describing sounds familiar.
Yeah.
So I want to sort of take a step back and ask about the scale of the movement. How many dissidents are we talking about? How long did the movement last? And who were they?
Sure. Well, how many of them there were, of course, depends on how you define, who's in the circle and who's not. This is also something that I struggled with for quite a few years. Like most people, I was hoping for a large number. I wanted that to help me make my case for the historical relevance of this phenomenon. But at some point, I just had to sort of face the facts as I found them. And the fact is that the number of what I would call core dissidents, people who appended their names and in many cases their addresses and sometimes their phone numbers to open letters, petitions, things that put them and their family members and loved ones at risk, was probably never more than about 1,000. And that circle of 1,000 people achieved its maximum extent in the spring of 1968. Now, just to give you a little bit of perspective, that's 1,000 core activists in a Soviet population of roughly 250 million people. So a tiny, tiny droplet in a very large ocean. And this got me, thinking that maybe what I needed to consider was not how big can I make the movement look to emphasize its historical weight, but to confront what I think is the undeniable and extraordinary fact that a tiny number of people had a completely outsized influence on the arc of the Cold War and of the second half of the 20th century. And that's really what I think one of the takeaways of the book is. But I'm not quite done with the circle, because the core activists may have numbered no more than 1,000 at their high point in 1968. But if we ask about the next concentric circle beyond them, that is, the number of people who were plugged into the networks that produced and consumed and disseminated samizdat texts, which means texts that were hand-typed and retyped and distributed literally from hand to hand by people who knew and trusted each other in most cases, this underground alternative print universe, well, not really print, but typed universe, to stay with the terminology, that number is in the tens of thousands. So many, many more times than the number of core activists. And I feel confident stating that number, in part because the KGB did my research for me. The KGB was very interested, more interested than any other entity on the planet, in tracking what dissidents were up to. And in the early 1970s, they engaged in a very prolonged, deep, damaging investigation of who was producing and consuming the leading dissident underground periodical, the so-called Chronicle of Current Events. And this investigation, it happened to be known as Case 24. This lasted over 2 years, and the KGB unearthed an enormous amount of data about samizdat distribution. And in a nutshell, what they were able to show was that Soviet citizens in every mid-size and large city, from Moscow and Kiev and Leningrad in the west all the way to Vladivostok on the Pacific coast, across 11 time zones, anybody in those cities, medium or large, could get samizdat. And samizdat was flowing across that entire interior space, that vast interior space of the Soviet Union, which is about 6 times the size of the United States if you don't include Alaska. So tens of thousands of people were plugged into the networks of samizdat. And then the next circle is even larger. Here we don't have hard numbers, but we have massive anecdotal evidence that suggests that millions, possibly tens of millions of Soviet citizens were regularly listening to the shortwave radio broadcasts that were reaching them from the offices of the BBC, Radio Free Europe, the Voice of America, the Deutsche Welle, Kol Yisrael, over half a dozen shortwave radio services that were constantly beaming Russian and Ukrainian and other Soviet language broadcasts to an enormous domestic audience. We don't know the numbers. We may never really have solid numbers, but I feel confident that they were in the millions.
So I want to ask you 2 questions about the place of the Soviet dissident movement, in a certain sense, internally and externally. The first is, Um, you sort of hinted at part of the answer to this question, but what role did the dissident movement have in the deterioration, decline, and ultimate disappearance of the Soviet Union? I mean, there are thousands of causal factors
Sure.
mentioned when one talks about the decline of the Soviet Union. The Cold War, the nuclear arms race, the economic disintegration, deterioration, and competition with the United States. Um, you're talking about a group of 1,000 people at the inner core. How do you understand its impact on that seminal development in global history?
Sure. Let's first start with what it didn't achieve according to its own goals. The goal of the movement, as articulated by Alexander Volpin, and then gradually spreading to other people, some of whom called themselves his disciples, the goal was to spread legal consciousness among the Soviet population and to induce the Soviet state to become more law-abiding and therefore more predictable and less dangerous to its own citizens. This is what I call a form of internal containment, not the containment articulated by George Kennan as the grand strategy of the United States in the Cold War, but an internal form of containment that used the law to put restraints on government behavior. Those agendas failed. The dissidents did not appreciably increase consciousness of the rule of law in the Soviet population. And if anything, the KGB became less law-abiding during the 20-year lifespan of the dissident movement, from the early 1960s to the early 1980s. And the KGB became less law-abiding because it discovered over and over again that when it tried to use the legal system, the courts, to prosecute dissidents, it always got the guilty verdicts, but it always or almost always lost the public relations battle. And the KGB's response to that very frustrating loss of political dividends from all these trials was to turn increasingly to extrajudicial forms of punishment, unregulated, unmonitored, very dangerous. So the dissident movement failed to achieve its own stated goals. But like as so often happens in history, there were unintended consequences of the movement that ended up being, in some ways, even more consequential. And I try to make the case in the book that one of the unintended, probably the most important unintended consequence of the movement was to show how archaic the form of political power was that was exercised by the Soviet state, to drain the system of legitimacy by showing over and over again how the Kremlin was incapable or unwilling to observe its own laws, to operate within the bounds of its own constitution. Now, you have to remember, the Soviet Union is a very unusual government. It's a government that claims to be the vanguard of human history. And I'm quoting, I'm not exaggerating. That was literally how it described itself, as the vanguard of human history. I mean, you can talk about the United States and manifest destiny, but I think the Soviet government actually outdid the American government in the scope of its ambitions and the depth of its world historical consciousness of itself. It's very hard to maintain a campaign where you cast yourself as the vanguard of history when this tiny band of dissidents is showing over and over again that you can't even observe your own laws. That's a contradiction, a moral and political contradiction that really sapped the regime of a great deal of legitimacy. You mentioned other things that also contributed to that decline of legitimacy, and they are probably more important quantitatively than what I'm describing the dissidents produced. The performance of the Soviet economy was really very damaging to the country's reputation, including in the eyes of its own citizens. Its failure to compete with the United States in the manufacturing and distribution of quality consumer goods also damaged its reputation. But the dissidents contributed to that hollowing out of legitimacy. And I think it's impossible to understand the manner of the Soviet collapse between 1987 and 1991, the sheer speed and suddenness of the collapse, you'll never understand that if you don't understand that the system was already largely hollowed out. Only systems that are hollowed out collapse like a house of cards in peacetime. So they did contribute in a very significant way to that process, I believe.
Okay, now I want to ask the second question about the place of the dissident movement outside of the context of the Soviet Union, which is to say, within what you call the transnational movement of dissent, within the world of human rights as it takes shape after the Second World War. Where do you think the dissident movement fits in that larger transnational story? I mean, you very helpfully juxtapose the legal strategy of civil obedience to the strategy of civil disobedience that animated the Black movement for equal rights in the United States. So there are already differences of very significant consequence that you've called attention to. Does the Soviet dissident movement belong to that larger history? And if so, where do you think it stands?
I do think that it becomes a part of that larger history. If by that larger history we stick to what you mentioned, which was the history of human rights NGOs and the attempt to articulate a global morality. Efforts have been made to locate Soviet dissidents in a different global history. That's the history of the student protest movements. Berkeley, Columbia, May 68 in Paris, in Frankfurt, in Rome. That, I think, it was a useful exercise, but ultimately I think it's barking up the wrong tree. The dissidents were not students. They were typically much further along in their lives and their careers. They were allergic to the idea of revolution that was so popular among the protesters of 1968, especially in Paris. So to the extent that a conversation was emerging fitfully between Soviet dissidents and certain counterparts in the West, that conversation was not with, the Daniel Cohn-Bendits of the world, of the left bank in Paris in 68. That conversation was with Amnesty International in London and with the International League for Human Rights in Strasbourg and Paris. Those were organizations with a very different demography. They were dominated by lawyers, people who were already successful in their careers. I mean, René Cassin, the founder of the International League, already had a Nobel Peace Prize to his name. He was an eminent jurist. These are the people with whom dissidents in the Soviet Union found eventually, and it was a struggle, found a common language. There are two chapters in the book that try to trace the relationship of Soviet dissidents with Amnesty International. And I chose Amnesty for two reasons. One, it was founded in 1961, and it was in the process of becoming the most important international human rights NGO of the 60s and 70s. Number two was that Amnesty has a phenomenal archive of its own internal workings, which is housed in Amsterdam at the International Institute for Social History. Just a pleasure to work in that archive, so well organized, so comprehensive. And it was the kind of collection supplemented by other sources that allowed me to really get a deep and sustained view of this emerging conversation between dissidents and amnesty activists.
Yeah, which is really such an important part of the story, which you describe in rich detail. I do want to shift gears for a moment to ask what you see as the relationship between the dissident movement, and here one also thinks of the place of Western NGOs, and the Soviet Jewish refusnik movement, which sought to gain freedom and the right to emigrate for Soviet Jews from the late 1960s. They seem to overlap in time, to a certain extent in cause, and perhaps even some of the personnel. But it's an obvious question that somehow seems to elude easy resolution.
Yeah. I published a separate article about that relationship between the so-called rights defenders on the one hand and the refusniks on the other. Um, and it is a very interesting problem because in the popular mind, both in the West and the Soviet Union, there was a strong tendency to conflate the two and to see them as the same thing. And I can't tell you the number of times when I was working on this project about the dissidents, about the rights defenders, and people would say, "Oh yeah, I remember, Natan Sharansky and the Learners and Vladimir Slepak," and I'd be like, "No, no, no, that's a different group. I'm not talking about them." And there's a good reason why those two groups were often confused with each other. One is there were, as you alluded, there were people who were amphibious and who swam in both pools. Not many, but there were some, and they were significant. Sharansky being the most important example of all. Number two, um, a very significant proportion of the rights defenders, people who did not actively identify as Jewish, and who were not, I think, what you and I would probably call Jewishly literate, but who had one or two parents who were Jewish and who were marked as Jewish in their Soviet passports, that percentage was very, very high, extraordinarily high, to the
How
point.
high? How high, Ben?
How high? Well, again, you have to define how you count people. If we include people who had at least one parent of Jewish origin, and then we say, okay, how many of that 1,000 inner core activists? I would say definitely more than half, possibly two-thirds.
Mhm.
And again, we need the perspective to know what that number means. That number means a lot when Jews constituted about 1% and probably a little less than that of the total Soviet population. So they are extraordinarily overrepresented in the dissident movement, the rights defense movement. The key difference between the two movements was that refuseniks, as the name implies, refuseniks were people who had applied to emigrate from the Soviet Union and who had been denied permission. They'd been refused. And the agenda of the Jewish emigration movement was to leave, to exit, not to fix anything, not to change anything, but just get out. The sooner the better. The dissidents, the so-called rights defenders, the правозащитники, had a very different, although overlapping agenda. They certainly defended the right to emigrate as one of the human rights that they wished to promote. But their own goals, as we talked about earlier, really centered around reforming the Soviet system, making it more law-abiding, placing constraints on what the state could do. So the one group had a domestic agenda. It was a rather modest one. It wasn't about toppling the government or taking over the reins of political power. It was about putting limits on what the state can do. The other not only was uninterested in domestic reform, but wanted to have nothing to do with it. Because after all, if your agenda is to leave the country, the last thing you want is to be entangled in some kind of disagreement with the government about how it's behaving. So there was an overlap between the movements on the level of human rights, but also on the level of personnel. But there were also fundamental, I would say, irresolvable tensions at the
Yeah, I
same
mean,
time.
that's the question. Did they relate to one another? How did they regard one another? Or did they basically operate in these kind of adjacent spheres, parallel universes, and not really have interaction with one another, which would seem hard to pull off?
Yeah. They did have connections. Um, Andrei Sakharov and other leading proponents of human rights repeatedly endorsed the right of emigration and spoke out, um, at some risk to themselves, in support of specific refuseniks who had been denied for years the permission to emigrate from the Soviet Union, and in many cases to rejoin family members, mostly initially in Israel, but then eventually in other countries as well. So the leading rights defenders consistently supported the agenda of the Jewish emigration movement. The Jewish emigration movement almost never supported the rights defenders because, as I said, they did not want to jeopardize the chance of gaining permission to leave by getting entangled in those kinds of disputes. And there were a number of figures who were able to participate in both. I mentioned Sharansky. Another is Vitaly Rubin, an expert on the history of ancient China and on Confucian and Buddhist philosophy, who started out as a rights defender and then was disillusioned by the lack of success of the rights movement in achieving its own stated agenda, and eventually switched and decided to emigrate, and in fact was able to leave and take up a professorship at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. These are, however, the exceptions. Most people abided by the notion that it's either one or the other, you can't do both. And furthermore, to the extent that there was mobility over time across the divide, in my research, I discovered that that mobility was exclusively in one direction. Disappointed, disaffected rights defenders, if they were Jewish and wanted to leave, migrated to the Jewish national movement. I don't know of a single example of motion in the other direction.
Okay, I want to turn our attention now to today and ask how you think the story of Soviet dissidents helps us understand post-Soviet Russia. There would seem to be a juxtaposition between the labyrinthine rules-based order of the Soviet Union and the more chaotic quality of post-Soviet Russia. But post-Soviet Russia, like Soviet Russia, remains a profound enigma to many of us in the West. And I'm just wondering what you think this story tells us about where we are today.
Sure. I should start out by saying that I originally wrote a completely different conclusion to the book. The subtitle of the book is The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, which is a kind of double entendre. It means, first of all, the many lives in this movement about which we know nothing because we've been so fixated on the alleged leaders and heroes, Andrei Sakharov, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the two men whose names became known around the world, not least because they each received the Nobel Prize. But the second meaning of my subtitle, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, is it reflects the fact that the movement went through several near-death experiences and had to reinvent itself and reformat itself. And so my original conclusion to the book prior to 2022 was going to be a brief look at the afterlife of the movement in post-Soviet Russia from 1991 till whenever I handed in the manuscript. I was going to look at the ups and downs, the kind of roller coaster reputational ride of the movement, where sometimes people praised it to the skies, the freedom fighters who brought down the evil communist regime. Some people cursed it, those terrible puppets of Western intelligence services who destroyed a great empire and cast its remnants into misery and poverty and lack of global respect. And yet a third group had said, and there were people who literally said this to me, colleagues in Russia, why are you wasting your time studying these people? They were just a sideshow in the Cold War. They don't really explain anything. You're just getting distracted. And then February 2022 happened, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And in the buildup to that assault, the Kremlin systematically dismantled all of the remaining institutional remnants of the dissident movement. I have in mind the Memorial Society, headquartered in Moscow, but with branches in 50 other Russian cities. I have in mind the Andrei Sakharov Center in Moscow, which was a museum and a public forum for debates and conversations and discussions and exhibitions. I have in mind the Helsinki Watch Group, which was sort of a human rights monitoring organization. All of these groups were systematically eliminated in the most premeditated way possible on the eve of the war in what is now clearly was a plan to remove any platform that could serve as a basis for public protest against the war that was about to be launched. So I looked at my conclusion. I thought, well, this is silly. Like the ups and downs of the afterlife of the dissident movement are moot. we now know what happened. Its afterlife was just crushed and dispersed and destroyed in the build-up to 2022. So I completely redid the conclusion to focus much more on the contemporary period, the period now. And the landscape, of course, is grim inside Russia. You may be interested in what Russians have learned from the dissident movement, but I can assure you that Putin and his fellow former KGB officers who dominate the upper ranks of today's Russian government, they learned their own lessons from the movement. They've become much more sophisticated manipulators of public relations than, the ham-fisted Brezhnev government. Putin has also, I think, learned from experience in his youthful days how to use emigration as a political tool. So the Soviet government forced about half of those original 1,000 core activists out of the country by the early 1980s, which was a good way of weakening the movement just by removing, half of its most important figures. But what Putin has done, or what he initially did in the immediate aftermath of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, is allow hundreds of thousands of people to leave the country before they could even cause any trouble. People just fled because they feared persecution. If they were male, they feared being drafted into the army. There was a sense of tremendous uncertainty about what was going to happen inside Russia while this war was going on. So all kinds of lessons have been extracted. But I think what you were getting at is, what lessons does the dissident movement have for actual or would-be opposition figures today? Most of those opposition figures are outside the country. They're in Berlin, they're in Yerevan, they're in Tbilisi. Some of them are in the United States. The Putin government, unlike the late Soviet government from the 1970s and 80s, has shown that it is not above, or it's not reluctant to use lethal violence against real or perceived opponents. Dozens and dozens of people, investigative journalists, political opposition figures, most famously Alexei Navalny, have been physically eliminated, assassinated by this regime. Now, Navalny's a really interesting case point for the question that you asked. For most of his career, he had a very disdainful attitude towards the dissidents. He literally said, I don't identify with those guys because they're losers, and I'm not going to be a loser. I'm going to win. Navalny was a trained attorney. He was not an amateur lawyer, the way so many of the dissidents attempted to engage with Soviet law, like Alexander Volpin. And I think most importantly, we didn't have time to get into this, but another of the paradoxes about the dissident movement, in addition to its allergy to rules of any kind in its own internal life, was its insistence that it was not political, that it was above or outside politics, which, to the Western mind is just baffling. They seem to be the most politically engaged people in the Soviet Union, bar none. But they insisted that by focusing on law and human rights, they were outside the political fray. Navalny never thought or spoke that way. As a matter of fact, he ran for office. He described himself as a politician. So he was out there in his explicitly political agenda. And I think that was a very liberating thing for him to do, because he didn't have to pretend that he was beyond politics the way the dissidents did. But as I said, for most of his life and his career, Navalny did not want to be associated with the dissidents, certainly did not want to be called one. But when he found himself imprisoned at the end of his life, and now not for 2 weeks or a month at a time, but for years with no end in sight, he started reading dissident memoirs. How he got them is a bit of a mystery to me. He read Sharansky's memoir. He read the memoir of Anatoly Marchenko, of Solzhenitsyn. He was, of course, especially interested in dissidents who'd done time in prison. That's a large corpus of texts in Russian history. He even corresponded with Natan Sharansky once he had read his memoir, which is just an amazing thing. And those letters are extraordinary to read. I hope somebody one day will put them together in an anthology. So one of the things that I've discovered about Navalny from reading his memoirs and writing a little bit about them is that this guy continued to grow as a person, as a thinker, until his dying day. He's a person in motion. He just can't sit still. His mind is constantly working, and his thinking about what the dissidents represented and his relationship to that legacy was evolving until the very end. It's a very moving story.
So in light of what you just told us about Navalny, and your thoughts about post-Soviet Russia, and your remarkable chronicle of the history of the Soviet Dissident Movement, I want to ask you, as a final question, how, in the wake of all that, do you understand the astounding toast of the Soviet Dissident Movement, which is the title of your book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause?
Yes, this toast, which was pronounced around endless numbers of kitchen tables in apartments in every major Soviet city, captures for me beautifully, efficiently, memorably what for me is the deepest enigma, not only of the movement, but of the people, the individuals who populated it. And I had the great fortune of meeting quite a few of them, interviewing them, getting to know some of them. And that is the enigma of the way they managed to blend in a single mind or a single heart, a kind of boldness and despair at the same time. To the success of what? Of this completely unlikely mission of placing formal constraints on this behemoth of a regime. And yet, even as they articulated that supersized ambition, they recognized that in some sense it was absolutely hopeless. And yet they couldn't not persist in their work, in their life's work. Boldness and despair at the same time in the same person. That's an amazing combination of qualities.
I should note that you conclude the book with these words: should Russians find their way to political pluralism and the rule of law, they too will need a usable past. The story of the Soviet dissident movement will be waiting. Professor Benjamin Nathans, author of the magisterial book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, thank you so much for making time to be with us today.
Thank you, David. It is always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.